name's John Mudd. I'm with the South Community Council, and I've been living in this area since 1984. The council's been around for about as long, and welcome for everybody. And we're here for, come on.
Rent is too damn high.
Okay, good. You know what we're here for. Ted Houghton, he's going to be your moderator today. And I've known Ted for a few years now, right? Yeah. A few years. He's on our board, and I'm really proud to have him there. He's been guiding us. He's done some great work. He works to transform New York City's response to homelessness and by developing innovative new shelter, affordable housing programs, and residences. Ted serves as an executive deputy for Commissioner of New York State Homes and Community Renewal. That's HCR. I think some of you know about the HCR, right? Mm-hmm. He was overseeing the state's affordable housing agencies and led the Supportive Housing Network of New York, a statewide membership organization of over 200 nonprofits. How come we're not in that? What? How come we're not in that network?
You should join. I introduce you. You just got to take the next step. I can't make the move for you, John.
Okay. What's more than what's on paper in his bio? He's been passionate. He's given his whole life to resolving the homeless issues and building shelters and housing. And he's a nonstop advocate. And I appreciate knowing him, just like I appreciate knowing everybody on the panel. And with that, I'm going to leave it to Ted to introduce. I guess you're going to introduce panels, or they're going to introduce themselves, either way, and then he'll start the conversation. Okay? And hang out and enjoy the show.
Right. Thanks, John. Very happy to be here, and thanks to the Midtown South Community Council and Unhomeless NYC for sponsoring this. This is an important conversation because the rent is too damn high, and it deserves a debate that really encompasses all of us because it affects all of us, stakeholders from the left and from the right, rich and poor, and all those things. That's a conversation that needs to be had. That's not what this is. This is going to be a decidedly progressive take on what we should be doing about homelessness and housing instability and all the other things that are happening because of our housing market failure. And it really is a housing market failure. A lot of times when people talk about homelessness, they talk about solving people's personal problems, mental illness and addiction and all those things. Those are not the causes of homelessness. People had addictions and mental illness for years and years. What's happened now is that there's no place for people to be. There's no place for people to live. We have a severe housing shortage. The numbers are really quite stunning. I mean, we have a housing and vacancy survey report that the city does every 3 years to see what's going on in the housing market. And the one that just came out says that we only have a vacancy rate of 1.4%. That's stunning. That is, just a few years ago in 2021, it was 4.5%, which is still very, very tight. People say below 5% is an unhealthy housing market. Now we're down to 1.4%. If you think it's worse than ever, you're right, it is. It's the worst that it's ever been in our lifetimes. And some of us have been around for a while. It's 60 years. That means that, there's a real lack of production of housing, which is really where it all starts. In the first half of 2023, there was only 33,000 apartments available to rent out 2.35 million apartments. That's crazy. I mean, we've got to do something, but building housing takes a very long time. One recent report said that New York City metropolitan area needs 340,000 new homes to be a healthy market. The mayor has promised 500,000 units, both affordable and market rate, in the next 10 years. He calls it a moonshot goal. He's right, because we have not built more than 25,000 or so units a year ever. And, not since the 1920s or 1950s. I mean, it's not in our lifetime. So we've really got to figure out a way to produce more housing, and we have to figure out a way to preserve housing. The people here today will have some ideas about that and will be able to tell us a little bit. But, right now, we're not doing it, In 2022, there were 45,000 proposed housing units filed with the Department of Buildings. People wanted to build about 45,000 units that year. This year, in 2023, the year that just concluded, only 9,900. So, less than half. That's a precipitous drop in our production, and production wasn't good to begin with. It takes 4 years to build housing, and now this trend has happened where certain things are happening that are really affecting the market, and we're not addressing them. We've had 7 years in a row of more than 20,000 units a year being built. That's better than we've had in a long time. It's not enough, but it's better than we've had in a long time. But only 4,500 to 6,000 of those units are affordable each year. So you can see that only about 10% of the units that are filed are affordable units. And of those, only about 800 to 2,100 in the last 7 years were built for formerly homeless people. So if you want to solve homelessness with 60,000 homeless people or 100,000, depending how you want to count it, we're not getting there at the rate that we're going. We really need to do more. And we're also seeing that affordability is expiring for a lot of units. So we're losing about 12,000 units a year with expiring affordability protections. We'll hear more about that today from the speakers. Many of those get saved. They get refinanced, and the owners recommit to keeping those units affordable. But if you're in a high market area, if you're in a high cost area like Manhattan, if the landlord can make money off it, they're going to make money off it. They're not going to preserve the affordability. We've been able to create some rent subsidies recently. City FEPS for formerly homeless people is a particularly good one. There is up in Albany, Senator Brian Kavanaugh has introduced, again, the Housing Access Voucher Program proposal, which hopefully will be voted into law this year, which will create a state-funded rent subsidy that will mimic Section 8, which is a federally funded rent subsidy. With all these different rent subsidies, that will help certain populations get into the market, but we've got to create more units for these vouchers to pay for as well. There's a lot of talk in Albany about passing a good cause eviction bill this year. There's a lot of support for it, even as there's opposition. There's also private market rate builders want a new version of 421A tax break, which allows them to not pay taxes to build new units of housing. And the lack of that for the last year and a half have really hurt production, as those numbers showed you before, going from 45,000 units starting a year to just less than 10,000. So there's a lot of people trying to do things, but the sense of urgency is about 10 years too late. So anyways, I want to bring on the panelists today. We have a lot of really good people here. To my immediate left is Rob Robinson, who's a professor of economics who teaches at American University, University of Miami, University of North Carolina, Charlotte, all over the place. He's also an international human rights activist, and he's also one of my go-to people when I'm trying to think the big picture thoughts that we need to drive the conversation. Longtime friend and really a great voice on this issue. We're hoping that Nichele Carver will join us from the United States Interagency Council on Homelessness. She's the senior regional advisor for our area, and hopefully we'll have her zoom in with us. We also have Charlie Dulik, who is a director of organizing for the Housing Conservation Coordinators, which is a local group for the West Side and all the way up to the Upper West Side and down to Chelsea, organizing tenants, trying to preserve housing. He's also an excellent writer. I really encourage you to look to the Baffler, baffler.com. Charlie has written some great articles about the way the landlord lobby puts up small landlords to speak for what are very large conglomerates that are running most of New York City's housing. Also a piece on what billionaires think our city should look like. It's really good stuff, and I encourage you to see that. We also have Audrey Huey, who's a member of Youth Against Displacement, and she's part of a group that has been fighting displacement and fighting for more sane and community-led efforts to redesign our neighborhoods and rezone our neighborhoods. And then finally we have Vittoria Fariello, who is the district leader of Assembly District Lower Manhattan. And she's also a resident of Gateway Plaza, the formerly affordable building that has been turned into a market rate apartment building. And she also spoke in favor of 100% affordable 5 World Trade Center when that issue was being debated. Anyways, I'm really happy to have all of you here, and I want to start with Rob. I mean, Rob, why is the rent too damn high, and what do we do about it?
I think there are a number of factors, but something that is fundamental and probably since this country was created is not addressing poverty, right? It's that's part of the problem, but there's also wages that don't rise as fast as rents do, right? So that's always going to put people behind the 8 ball, and it carries over, it continues through generations. So people are always struggling with respect to housing. I think for me, it's a big victory today. I don't know if people heard about it, but rent stabilization was pushed away by the Supreme Court for the second time since October, and we have some lofty rent stabilization here in New York City. I live in a rent stabilized apartment, and I think it's incredible that we have such policies in place. We need to see more of it. It can be strengthened, but I think there are ways to do it. But
preservation, just to be clear, what happened today, the landlords brought a lawsuit against the existence of rent stabilization in New York City, and what happened?
And the Supreme Court refused to hear the case, and it's the second time since October.
Yeah.
So it means victories for communities and people in high levels of government here in New York City. The city has stood behind rent stabilization. Could be better, right? They could put more effort and energy into it, but they have stood behind it, understanding that there's a true need. So I think that's incredible. We have to take these small victories sometimes, rather than the big win that we all wish for, right? The creation of 50,000 units of affordable housing. But one thing I just want to throw in the mix, and Charlie can probably talk to this better because of his architecture background. I think economics right now, so interest rates are very high. So I think you get people backing away that might otherwise want to construct buildings, right? But with the interest rates so high, it's causing a problem. And it backfires into rental markets, even home ownership. I was on a call today with Habitat for Humanity, and people were talking about individual homeowners. So you can't afford to buy right now. Interest rates are too high. So.
Yeah, I mean, between interest rates going up to the levels they're at now, much higher than they've been for many, many years, plus the loss of the property tax break that 421A gives to new developments, it's making it very difficult to make the numbers work for developers to build the housing unless it's for people who have very high incomes, or unless it's subsidized as affordable housing. But the amount of money that we have available to subsidize affordable housing is also limited.
I would be careful though. I'm sort of, I'm skeptical of the 421A because to me, like what we ended up doing was saturating the market with market rate housing. that wasn't the true need, right? We shot ourselves in the foot with 421A. So I think it has to be constructed a little bit differently than it was in the past. And area median income has a lot to do with that.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And I mean, every affordable housing program is less than perfect.
That's right.
And 421A was started as a program just to get people to build housing in New York City. It didn't even have affordability restrictions when it first started in the 70s. We've added those restrictions and gotten more for the tax break than we used to. But you know, criticisms that it's a giveaway to developers, you know, are valid and worth hearing. On the other hand, we want people to build housing. We need it.
Yes.
That more supply is going to help us bring down the rent.
Absolutely.
Charlie, you've been looking at this issue from a number of angles. When we're looking for solutions, what would you focus on?
Yeah, you know, I think there are infinite economic, social, political contexts you could look at to why we're here and why housing is so unaffordable. I also think that I would offer kind of almost like a tautological response, which is that we're in this crisis because we don't have enough tenant power. I think that, you know, housing prices aren't just on the rise in New York City; they're on the rise across the country in, you know, every major city. I think you could point to a lot of things like post 2008, you know, major investment in rental stock by Blackstone, by, you know, extremely large players in global real estate, and I think that tenants don't currently and haven't had enough power to win everything we want. I know that's kind of a shortcut answer, but when you look at the earliest versions of rent control and rent stabilization passed in the 20s and then again in the 40s and 50s through the 70s, those were won because of very radical tenant activity. I mean, in the 20s you had, I mean, there's just insane reports. There's grandmas in the Bronx that are beating police trying to evict tenants with pots and pans. There's, you know, mobs of hundreds of people storming courts and stopping evictions from happening. And, you know, at the end of the day, then that resulted in both actually rent stabilization or rent control in the 20s and a massive program to allow insurance companies to invest in housing that brought supply up again. I think public housing, again, as a result of, you know, massive efforts by tenants, by a broader tenant movement. I think wins we've had more recently, like closing a lot of the loopholes against rent stabilization in 2019, were because of you know, being able to exert a lot of tenant power. And I think when we think about what we want to win now, whether it's new social housing, whether it is stronger eviction protections, expanding eviction protections, you know, we go down the list and everything that we're all going to talk about that we want, it all comes back to having organized tenants in our buildings and across our portfolios, and then being able to flex that power more broadly across the city and state.
Can I follow up?
Sure, but you got to let other people.
Yeah, but Charlie, this is one thing that I've always struggled with, right? I agree with you. We have to have people bubble up from the ground and take control. But how do we do it? How do we get people? How do we move people? We stood here Saturday and watched a film called Rabble Rousers.
Yeah.
And we saw Fran Golden fight a 50-year fight, right? And those folks on the Lower East Side to get change. But you look at people today and you try to get them involved in a fight like that, and people back away.
Well, I have a lot of answers, but I know Vittoria and Audrey do too, so hopefully we can get everyone's in here.
Well, Vittoria, I mean, you're a resident of Gateway Plaza, which was a fully affordable development that went market rate in 2009. It got deregulated, and slowly, as units turn over, those units have become market rate units, and there are fewer and fewer people with tenant and rent protections living there. Could you tell us a little bit about that experience and what the tenants are doing to try to, you know, either stave off any further loss of affordability or to expand, go back and bring back some affordability?
Sure. So I don't know if this is working. Can you hear me?
I think you got to turn it on.
Wait.
Turn it on.
It should be on.
There's a switch.
This one works too.
Oh, there's one. So I lived in Gateway Plaza, originally. When Gateway Plaza was built in the 1980s, it was not rent stabilized. The tenants organized and they actually sued LeFrak and the Battery Park City Authority, and they won rent stabilization in a settlement outside of it, so they settled. So Gateway Plaza is unique because Battery Park City is state-owned land. So LeFrak, that owns and runs Gateway Plaza, has a contract with the Battery Park City Authority, meaning the state, in order to continue a ground lease. So they basically, my understanding is, I know that they actually pay $300,000 in ground lease per year. The building next door that has, I think, 60 units pays $1.5 million a year. So for this, we don't know how much we're getting in terms of rent stabilization because, as you mentioned, Ted, so the rent stabilization was renewed until 2009 when the new agreement said that it was grandfathered in. So if you lived in Gateway in 2009 or before, then you would have rent stabilization, but anybody else coming in after that would be market rate. In 2020, that was renewed. In 2020, the Gateway Tenant Association was told that they were about approximately 600 units out of 1,700 units that were rent stabilized. But this was at the height of the pandemic. And I'm serving as a district leader and also on the board of the Tenant Association. I know that we've lost a lot of those rent stabilized people. So my guess is that we're below 400. So the question is now we're trying to organize a market rate tenants. But the frustration, and Charlie, hopefully you can help us out here, but the frustration and the difficulty is that, people can't afford to stay there. So it's a very high turnover. Or you have like five young adults living in a one bedroom, right? And so their interest in organizing can be tentative. So we have to show them that it is important for them in order to stay, because in order to build community, which is what makes us a healthy society, our communities, we need to organize and push back against this. I think there's a lot of problems with, Ted, you mentioned a number of statistics when you first started. And I'm really curious to kind of peel back the onion and see what's under those stats. Because when I walk around downtown, I see a lot of empty apartments. So one of the things I would love to see is a vacancy tax, which is something that we have, especially in certain parts of Manhattan and certainly in Lower Manhattan, we have a lot of luxury apartments that are held by people who don't actually live there. And we don't know this, first of all, because we don't have rent rolls. So I think that's another thing we should ask our legislators to do, to require that if you have over a certain amount of numbers of units that you publish rent rolls. Obviously, you don't have to publish names of people who live there, but you publish what number of units you have, how many bedrooms they have, what it's being rented for, and for whom, is it a primary residency for this person? These are all things that we need to understand, those statistics that you were saying before. Because I really, I know in Vancouver in 2019, they actually they implemented the vacancy tax. What happened there, they had about 300,000 vacant units, so they thought. In 2 years, it dropped in half. It literally halved. So that is something that we can start to do here, but I also want to let Audrey speak, because I think it's important that as we think about addressing our housing issue, that we have to think about the communities that are there and how they will be displaced when we bring in 80% luxury.
Audrey, Youth Against Displacement was active in responding to the proposed and then passed Soho rezoning, which affected a swath of land much larger than just the Soho neighborhood. Could you tell us a little bit about what happened there and what were there victories, were there losses? What do we do next?
Well, it is working. Okay. In 2008, there was the East Village rezoning plan, which excluded strategically Chinatown and Lower East Side. It excluded us from protection, from high rises, from height caps on buildings, from luxury developments like hotels, other big box stores. And so it's very racist development because it excluded these neighborhoods that were, majority people of color, immigrants, etc. And so by protecting these neighborhoods near us, it pushed the luxury development into our neighborhoods, and it causes displacement. And Yad has a unique perspective of talking about the collusion, the connection between the developers and our city government. City government, which enacts the vision of developers to create luxury high-rises, etc., that push the residents out and push out of affordable housing as well. And so in response, the community made the Chinatown Working Group rezoning plan, which would protect Chinatown and Lower East Side by putting height limits on buildings and limits on big box stores, luxury hotels, and mandating true affordable housing. And so we can see that when the community rallies together, sort of addressing what Rob brought up of like, how do we get people together to fight for affordable housing and against these developments, we've seen that. We've seen successes here. For example, in 2016, at 8385 Bowery, which was a rent-stabilized building, 2 rent-stabilized buildings, they were evicted. They were illegally evicted, and so the law was not protecting them. The law was being broken in order to enact this. And so the community came together because we were able to rally hundreds of people who, through this larger conversation of who makes decisions about what happens in our community, like everyone relates to these rising rents and wrongful eviction. And so we were able to get hundreds of people together, organize rallies, marches, as well as 2 hunger strikes because the tenants were that organized and what is being hungry compared to you don't have somewhere to live, you're on the street, they are willing to have a hunger strike. And so after all these actions, they were brought home. And so it wasn't the law that did this, it wasn't those protections, it was through the community demanding this that we were able to put pressure on them. And so we've seen many victories in our community through community pressure on the government and on developers, and we've seen how lawsuits and other avenues have fallen short. And so that's why we see that there is a possibility. The city, the developers, they like to put forth this narrative that story's over, the fight is over, that it's inevitable, that we need development because we have no housing. And so we're going to make unaffordable housing, and we're going to say, oh, this amount percentage is going to have affordable housing, which isn't actually even affordable because of how it's calculated. And so our perspective is that we're not just fighting against displacement, but we're fighting for community rezoning that actually protects our community. We fight for Chinatown Working Group plan that protects us. And so we see that vision for the future.
Great. I see we're joined by Nichele Carver from the United States Interagency Council on Homelessness. Hi, Nichele. Welcome.
Hi, thank you.
So we just started talking a little bit about displacement and about the effects of expiring affordability on New York City. You oversee a large area of the Northeast for the Biden administration on issues of homelessness, and homelessness is kind of the canary in the coal mine for all these housing problems that we're now seeing. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're seeing in terms of homelessness in New York City and what the real challenges are and where the achievements that you've had recently that you see and a way forward for addressing homelessness? You can split it into bite-sized questions, but one of the things that happens, Rob, is that I focused a lot on production because we really don't have enough units, and we don't have the right kind of units. But a lot of times, units have to be preserved as well. Could you tell us a little bit about the effort to preserve units through regulation, through reinvestment? What can we do to make sure that once we've created an affordable unit, it stays affordable and people can live stable lives in it?
Well, I think we know regulation works, right? We've seen it, rent stabilized rent control works. But I think we also have opportunities, especially since the pandemic, with vacant hotels and vacant office buildings, repurpose these buildings, right? To create housing for specific needs, specifically towards homeless folks, right? There are some things in the way, I think you know better than I do at the state level and the local level, but you gotta focus on that. Focus on that and remove those obstacles. Because the money you're paying right now, when New York City's paying to put people in shelters is ridiculous.
Yeah.
Right? You know, we have probably over a $2 billion budget a year to temporarily house people in shelters, and that makes no sense. So, you know, it's gonna take some creative thinking and some different ways of doing, you know, of creating housing, but I think preservation is a way, right? Public housing reinvestment, that's, you know, it takes something from the federal level. Public housing worked, and we know it worked, right? And, you know, but there's been systemic disinvestment, and the government wanted to get out of the housing business, right? I always make the argument that in New York, the reason why you couldn't destroy it in New York like you did other cities, because there's 500,000 people living there. Where do you put that other city, right? You know, so, you know, there's been a little bit of hesitation on New York City's part. But I just think we have to think creatively and think outside the box.
I mean, and it comes back down to power.
That's right.
Once again. I'm hoping that, Nichele, we have your audio now.
It's the room.
There,
Can you hear me?
Yes.
All
Seriously, okay.
There was $80 billion in the proposed budget for reinvesting in public housing. That fell out during the negotiations, and we're still underfunded on public housing. And one of the problems in Washington is that there aren't that many senators that care about public housing, because there aren't that many states that still have a large amount of public housing. I mean, what's your thinking in terms of expanding housing opportunities for homeless people, for people who are at risk of homelessness? What's the federal administration doing to help New York City in this area?
Okay, so I'm hoping you guys can hear me now.
Yeah.
All right.
Yes, okay, awesome. So first I want to just say hello everyone. My name is Nichele Carver. I work for the United States Interagency Council on Homelessness. I'm based right outside of Richmond, Virginia, but I serve New York, New Jersey, and all of New England. So the first thing I would say is I think everybody pretty much understands that we have some dysfunction in Washington. That's an understatement. Because right now I'm not sure if I'll be paid past March 1st because Congress is who controls the budget. And I wanted to start with that because no matter what any president puts in their budget, Congress is the controller of the purse strings. And so Biden actually had money in this last budget to increase HUD, to increase outreach for homelessness, to increase money to build more housing. And you were absolutely right. Some of that landed on the cutting floor. Some of that is still in there. But it does not look like there's going to be any increases. And because I'm not able to lobby, it's going to take people to lobby their own Congress folks and their senators to say, we want this, we need this. Before I move any forward, I want to just tell you a little bit of stats of how bad this is, because it's bad across the entire nation. From 20 to 23, from 2020 to 2023, so smack dab in the middle of the pandemic, rents increased by 24% nationwide. So went up, but at the same time, our incomes only increased by 3.2%. So you see right there, we were already in trouble pre-pandemic, and it only got worse. We also have that about half of the people who rent in this country pay more than 30% of their income towards rent. Out of that group, so half, and then you have to think out of that group, 26.4% spend more than 50%. So we have a larger problem And it's affordable housing. We don't have a place in this country where a person can live if they only make minimum wage. And I believe the stat was they needed to work like 80-something hours a week to just be able to afford the bare minimum. We have a national shortage of about 7.3 million affordable housing units. So we have a bigger issue, and it's exacerbated in New York City. Like, New York City kind of shows the entire world how bad it is, but it's like this everywhere. And even with federal rental programs, so even if everything went like it was supposed to, we still would only have rental assistance for about 1 in 4 likely eligible households. So we have a bigger issue of, gosh, I don't know how to say this because I am a government worker, but I'm still a person. We have a problem with people who are at the top 1% having a lot of control of our government, along with control over everything. So capitalism, I am taking my government hat off, but capitalism is part of why we're in this situation. That's the best way to put it.
Preach, Nichele.
Hopefully nobody reports me and I lose my job for it.
Preach.
But that's the truth in this.
Yeah.
We're not going to get out of here until we figure out a way to deal with the issue of America being very dependent on capitalistic ways.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think that's a very good point, and a good point, and refreshing to hear someone who is in government saying that, even if you didn't say it, and we'll all swear up and down that you didn't. But if it comes to that, but and it something that was said earlier about all the vacant luxury apartments that are in New York City. There was an effort a couple years ago in Albany to pass a pied-à-terre tax, basically for luxury apartments that sell over a certain amount that are not inhabited full-time should pay a supplementary amount on property tax above that. It didn't go anywhere. There really wasn't any organizing around it, but that would have helped to bring in that extra revenue and devote that to affordable housing. And so some of those kinds of strategies might be something to bring in along with the more local strategies to prevent people from being displaced, which are equally important, but they're very much local. I don't know, Charlie, if you have some ideas about ways that we can wed the local efforts with a larger housing agenda that looks at some of the macro trends that we're seeing.
Yeah, I think the statewide housing movement, Housing Justice for All, has a great platform this year that speaks to a lot of underlying issues. I think it speaks to different parts of the housing world really well. You mentioned the Housing Access Voucher Program, which would help homeless New Yorkers and people at risk of homelessness. There's going to be some significant legislation on the way to continue to reform, strengthen, and expand rent stabilization, which is key for the 1 million rent stabilized tenants here, and then surrounding counties. There's good cause eviction, which would significantly help unregulated renters, and then I think most importantly is what was recently announced the Social Housing Development Authority, and the idea that New York State can and should develop hundreds of thousands of units of publicly owned and operated, democratically controlled, deeply affordable housing. And to me, that's where there's a significant long-term alternative vision. And like you mentioned, it takes a long time to build any new units, affordable or otherwise. There is a lot of ways that new construction can lead to immediate local displacement. So we need those tenant protections immediately and along the way, so that we can achieve kind of the long-term goals in a really equitable and significant way.
Vittoria, do you feel like the tenant protection system is working now? Or what could we do to strengthen tenant protections? I mean, what specifically would you be pushing for here in New York?
Well, we don't really have tenant protection here. I mean, we have rent stabilization for some of them. It has to be enforced. I think we were discussing before, prior to this, about the 421A program, where for years, a lot of the 20% that was supposed to be rent stabilized was not. And actually lawsuits were brought and won because the tenants were not told that they were entitled to rent stabilization. So we need enforcement. But we also need to, just to piggyback on what Nichele was saying, we need to think about housing as a need. We look at, in terms of, capitalism cannot work for something that is a need. And that is healthcare, and that is housing, and that is education. And when we're trying to make a market fix the housing crisis, we will never fix it. We have to have regulation. We have to, and it's the only way we can do that. So what do we need? Good cause eviction it's got a lot of issues with it right now, but it's something that's workable. But there should be limitations on how much people can raise your rent. Just straight up limitations. Because people cannot plan for their future if they have no idea how much they're paying rent next year. I mean, to hear these stats that Nichele was saying, that, that was it 27% of the, what was the number? I'm sorry, I can't remember, of the,
It was a 24% increase.
Yeah.
And
Right.
our income went up by 3.2.
right, and also people paying 50% of their income in housing is never, I mean, this hurts capitalism, right? Because then you don't have the money to put into the system anyway. So it's really not even, it's all backwards. So we need to take this, we need to accept that housing, thank goodness that the Supreme Court did not take the case today. And we hope that they don't take the case because historically we have treated property as a market item. But that is what we need to do. We need real regulation. The only thing that's going to take us out of this is rent regulation. We can build, but again, what's affordable, as Audrey was saying, and as Rob has brought up, AMI is not the measure that we should be using here, right? And so we need something that can provide housing stability here.
I mean, Audrey, you fight against displacement and I've made clear that I think we need to build more housing, and it needs to be the right kind of housing. And I've spent my life focused on housing for people who are homeless or at risk of homelessness. How do we reconcile efforts of local communities to keep their neighborhoods the way they want, and like in your case, low-rise neighborhoods with affordable housing and strong tenant protections? How do we reconcile that with a larger effort to expand production of housing?
I think currently that efforts to create more housing is what we're told is what makes it inevitable that luxury development has to happen. And I think that the issue is also about protection. When we don't have protection, that's what causes a lack of affordable housing and displacement. And so with rezoning is what determines development. And so we've seen direct effect of that, like in Two Bridges in Lower East Side. After the 2008 rezoning that excluded us, Excel proposed to build 4 mega luxury waterfront towers, so not affordable, and also next to affordable housing, which then obviously raises the property value of the entire area, raises the property taxes, and so also encourages landlords who have rent-stabilized units to evict their tenants and sell to developers and make a greater profit. And in 2017, the councilperson Margaret Chan told us that this is a done deal, there's nothing we can do, this is what happens. Development happens and it's inevitable. But that's not the case, because actually, when we rallied thousands of people to different marches, we got 20,000 signatures of the community that like, we don't want this development, that poses a threat. And so every day since then that the towers have not gone up is a victory for us. And in fact, the developers haven't been able to get a loan because they know that this community doesn't stop. Every time that they try to break ground, every time they try to develop it, we go there and we protest and we march. And so in fact, the developers have actually sold to another developer. It might happen again because this is just an area that clearly, the community strong is not going to, this is not going to happen. And so fighting for better protection and rezoning is how we reconcile that, is that Chinatown Work Group Plan mandates affordable housing that doesn't disallow any sort of building. It disallows luxury building that displaces and gentrifies the area. So there isn't really a contradiction between protection and wanting affordable housing, and then our housing crisis of needing more housing for everyone. So those things are kind of work together.
When we think about housing, we usually think about federal resources when we're talking affordable, because the federal government has led the way, first with public housing, and then with other kinds of subsidies for mortgages and the Section 8 rent subsidy and low-income housing tax credits that have allowed us to build affordable housing. What's on the table this year, Nichele? I mean, are there any improvements that we can see, or things that will help New York City that are on the table being negotiated right now? I know that the housing budget bill is about to be passed, or I think it's still being negotiated. Is that right?
You're talking about on the federal level, the THUD bill?
Yeah.
Yes, it has not. And THUD stands for transportation, and then they've coupled it with housing and urban development. I'm not sure why, but it has. So it's the THUD bill that has not been negotiated yet. But everything we're hearing is there will be no increases. Like there's just not going to be any increases. And what I'll say is we know that vouchers are one of the ways that we can help to make sure people have a place to live. The other thing I want to make sure everybody understands, people who are middle class and above get way more subsidies from the federal government than people who have lower incomes ever have. So it's this odd dynamic of people with middle to higher incomes wanting to police people with lower incomes. However, people with lower incomes are not getting as much money from the federal government. So it really should be flipped around if you think about it. And so one of the things I would encourage everybody to do is to start challenging this notion of, by giving a person who doesn't have as much money a voucher or something, the government is giving a handout, because I receive many more handouts, I think, than anybody I've ever served just because I own a home. Like I haven't done anything special, I didn't pee in a cup, I didn't jump through a hoop, I just own my home and I get a subsidy. And so for that reason, I encourage people to fight and challenge when you start getting policed because you need a voucher, like you require a voucher.
And when
so
you say a subsidy for home ownership, you're talking about the mortgage interest tax deduction.
I'm talking about the mortgage interest credit, yes.
And often when you see tax deductions and credits, they don't look like handouts, and so it's easier for people to ignore them, right?
It is so much easier.
They don't exist.
Yeah. And it's not just easier to ignore, it's easy to kind of brush it off as that's not the same. But it truly is the same, if not worse. Because I didn't do anything special for it. You understand what I'm saying? Like, this really is taking away from the tax base. But nobody talks about that. We always talk about, subsidies are costing money and people aren't doing what they need to do to earn this and the bootstrap BS and all that stuff. When you truly look at it, businesses, companies are getting very large subsidies. Middle class folks, upper middle class, the subsidies are outrageous. And again, me and my family of 4 receive a much greater subsidy than other families of 4. And I grew up really poor in Washington, D.C. My mother never received anything near what we receive here as a middle class family. So I can speak from a place of I've been on both sides, and I know for a fact that I get way more subsidy than my mom who's on SSI.
Are there things on the state level, Charlie, Housing Conservation Coordinators is involved with Housing Justice for All and other campaigns? Are there things like that on the state level that we can push for this year?
Yeah, absolutely. I have a flyer for our West Side Tenant Union, the West Side Neighborhood Alliance. On the back of it is a cheat sheet of just kind of some quick legislative things that are going on. That is worth grabbing. I know I don't necessarily want to just start listing off things and go into extreme detail on bills, but yeah, I think I mentioned some of them earlier. Some increasing vouchers, some increasing of strengthening and expanding rent stabilization, tenant protections, eviction protections, and then that bill for expanding or creating a social housing development authority. And I think it's about all of those things and more, and continuing to push. I mean, these are going to be long fights. When we look at the rent law fight from 2019, where we closed with nearly a dozen loopholes, closed the ability to deregulate units, to jack up 20% rents on rent stabilized units during vacancies. That was the result of literally decades of building. So these are long fights. It's important that we stick a stake in the ground right now and have this push kind of on all levels, from regulation and protections to affirmatively what type of alternative visions for development we do want to see outside of the market. So the answer is there's a lot, and wherever you feel passionate about wanting to get involved is a great place to start to push.
So how would people get involved? I mean, because there are a lot of things going up in Albany, and the budget's going to be decided soon, and end of session is at the end of June, when a lot of other things are going to be decided, and housing really is front and center this year. And so how would people in the audience or people watching us from home, how do they contact you? How do they get involved?
Yeah, so I think most neighborhoods in New York City have some sort of local tenant union. Maybe it's an autonomous tenant union, maybe it's a group supported by a nonprofit, maybe it's something else. I think getting in touch with that group is a great place to start always, at least to learn about different things that are going on. I also think it's really important to organize in our own buildings. Many of us in this room are facing issues from poor repairs to crazy rent hikes and lack of tenants' rights to a million other things. And I think it's really important to be grounded in our own buildings and kind of the fights for stability and protection we have on the ground. So that's another great place. And then honestly, if you just want to talk to me after this, I can definitely recommend any groups that might be by you that might be good to plug in.
Anybody else want to suggest anything? Vittoria or Audrey?
I would actually love to make a pitch for World Trade Center. So I haven't gotten a chance to discuss that, but the World Trade Center, 5 World Trade Center is the last site at the World Trade Center to be designated, and they decided to build a 80-story luxury rental building. That was what they came out with. The community got together and said, no way, no how, this is public land. The World Trade Center has gotten over $2.8 billion in subsidies. This is being built by Silverstein. We want 100% affordability. So we've gotten it to a third, and while our elected officials seem to be happy with that, the coalition is not. We want more. So we are very grateful for the 30%, for the third 1/3, but we do believe that we deserve more. And there are funds that are undedicated that would come, that could be used to increase the number of permanently affordable units. And the AMI, which we've used, has been from
That's an area median income.
right, so that's to make it deeply affordable. That was something that, again, the community wanted. This is a singular opportunity. When our elected officials say that communities don't want affordable housing, this site here has fantastic schools, gorgeous parks, it's right on top of a transportation hub. It's walks from jobs at Wall Street and in the Civic Center. This is the place to have affordable housing. So we did just put out a call. I sent out an email this afternoon asking that we ask for money from what is called the Joint Purpose Fund at the Battery Park City Authorities funding. So they collect rent on, as I was explaining before, ground rent from the land at Battery Park City. Right now, there's approximately $120 million sitting in this fund. They collect $30 million a year, and it's supposed to go to affordable housing. And they told us, yeah, we have projects for that. And I said, what are they? Silence, crickets. We have a project. It's being built. Let's build 100% affordable at 5 World Trade Center. So, there we go.
Well, I think it's interesting because of the way that we spend our money and the way that money can get appropriated in the federal, state, or city budget. It bows to political realities, and the way that you can hide certain things in tax breaks bows to other political realities, and you try to win where you can. And my understanding with World Trade Center is that, aside from the fact that Larry Silverstein is doing very well, thank you very much, from all of this, having 30% of a luxury building affordable is achieved by taking forcing the person making the outrageous profits on that luxury housing, the 2/3 units, to pay for the other 30%. Whereas if we're doing 100% affordable building, that would be using money from the city's or the state's appropriated budget to invest on those. So that would take money away from building housing in other neighborhoods unless you were able to increase that funding.
Right, so there's a number of things with that. First of all, again, the location of 5 World Trade Center brings with it, if you're not just buying an affordable unit, you're buying access to some of the top schools in the state. You're buying access to, like I said, waterfront and to jobs and all things that that right now are really reserved for the privileged, right? So why wouldn't we use this opportunity there? Secondly, we hear this, yes, and one thing that the coalition very much fought, they did not want to touch any of the funding that went to any other affordable housing. But we see these funds and we don't see the affordable housing. We see them go out, we don't see the affordable housing. There's also, when we first started asking for this, the Lower Manhattan Development Corporation that was set up to dispense funds from 9/11 came to our community board and said they had $126 million to disperse. We said, great, we have a project for you. By the time we got our elected officials on board and to help us out, we are now, today, begging for $30 million that's left over because they have to dispense those others. So that's money that is now going to the museum, which the community is very upset about because the museum has taken items and artifacts from the community, and we still have to pay to go in to see it. It's also going to the Perlman Center, which I'm very much for the arts, but thankfully the arts are very well funded, privately, generally speaking. Affordable housing is not. No private people are investing in affordable housing, so that's where that money should have gone. We have $30 million left over. We are still in discussions. Our representative Dan Coleman is trying to help us get that $30 million to go towards the 5 World Trade Center to increase that. So there are for sure reasons so that's money that wouldn't go to affordable housing anywhere else. It's only designated for that area. The Joint Purpose Fund, as I said, when they said, yeah, we have projects, and there was no answer, why would you not put it in a project that you have going on? It's real, it's happening. And it's coming with all these other things for it, not just the units.
Yeah. Similar things happen in your neighborhood, Audrey. What's the answer there? I mean, are there opportunities to build affordable housing using resources that are other than the standard affordable housing resources of federal low-income housing tax credits, city subsidy, and ongoing rental subsidies?
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of a myth created by the greed of developers and the government that we cannot build affordable housing, that everyone cannot have housing. We sort of see that right now in Chinatown and Lower East Side. Something we're fighting is this mega jail that has been proposed to go up as part of de Blasio's borough-based jail plan. And so there's billions going into this jail development, mega jail that would be a skyscraper jail that no one in our community wants. And so that's something we've been organizing events. We've had a picket line for over 2.5 years outside of this institution, MOCA, that basically took a $32 million bribe from the government in order to feign community support of this mega jail. And so one of the demands of our picket line is to return that $32 million to the community to be invested in small businesses and other things. And additionally, we don't want a jail in that location. But when we think about our future, we can think of this as like an area that is basically undesignated community space, and this money can be spent on other things like affordable housing. And so it's sort of the myth that is just because of the greed of developers and city government that we cannot allocate funds in these ways, that people cannot build affordable housing. We just look at what it's being spent on otherwise, on something that the community doesn't want, the community is crying out against. Everyone in the community knows about picket line, everyone is against jail. Only the developers, only the sellout community institutions like the Museum of Chinese America that feign support for this jail, they're the ones that are putting out this myth. So yeah.
Nichele, when you see, you're familiar with what New York City is doing to create housing and address homelessness. How do we compare to other localities that you're looking at? I mean, are we doing as much as we can with the federal resources that are available to us? Are we putting as much as we should of our local resources and state resources?
The best way to put it is things are very disjointed in New York City. And I say that being a person who ran homeless services for the Commonwealth of Virginia. So the first thing I did was try to see how the state connected with New York City. And it almost feels like New York City is a separate entity. And I realize there are 8 million people, I get it. The problem is by not having that state support, you actually lose, you almost lose links in a chain because it's the federal chain, the state chain, the city chain. That money sometimes flows through, and New York City seems to be doing a lot of things on an island alone, whether that's by choice or by how the state has just chose to operate. That's very different than how it is in many other states. That on top of when you look at your city government, it doesn't always seem to be as connected to the actual providers of homeless services, to the developers. So there's another disjointedness, a lack of connection. And it feels like that makes it so much harder to do a job in a place that's already magnified in terms of numbers. It seems like you want to do more working together than working in silos, and New York City is truly the first time I've ever seen silos that are harming to this level. I always say my job is so easy, and then you add New York City. Like everywhere else, I can kind of talk them into working together. The Adams administration is really not as interested, is the best way to put it. So I've been working with local providers. We actually came there and met with Rob and some groups that he had put together for us. So I'm actually going more ground level with New York City because it's a little bit harder to work on the level of the city. So I work at the state level, and then I work with providers and people with lived experience. And that's a harder way to do this job. However, my goal is to get housing built and to get, see what laws we can get passed and what policies. And if it means, the administration isn't the best way to do it, then I just go around.
Okay, that's interesting to hear that perspective. I'm trying to think of instances where the city and the state could work better together, and there's always ways you can work better together. But the state is providing a large portion of its tax credit allocation, which is important for building affordable housing and supportive housing. And there are state funding streams that support these things. What's missing is a state rental subsidy, and the city is spending something around $600 million on rent subsidies. And it seems that New York City and New York State are building more affordable housing than most other states, right? Is there?
No, they are. They really, again, your numbers are massive, right? So just in terms of sheer numbers, but if you go per capita, no.
Yeah.
If you go per capita, it's not happening. And I think, just to be clear, I think the bigger issue is there's lots of money being poured in. There's not lots of thought to how we can do this the right way. Because, you keep dumping water on the dumping money on the problem, that's great. It's just not going to solve the problem. And so, again, I compare it to places like I had a call with the people in Maine. Maine is tiny, but they're also looking at it as this is a statewide problem. These cities in the state have to work together to figure out how to solve it. That's how Texas, which God help me for saying that, but Texas is actually trying to figure out ways to work with Austin and with Dallas and with Houston. So what I'm saying is when the state and the cities work together and think of things as if both are dependent on each other and not, here's the money, do what you need to do, you just have different outcomes.
I'm trying to think of specifics. I don't know, Rob, if you want to expand on
I don't
that.
want to go into specifics, but I want to just reinforce the point that Nichele is making. For years, Ted, and you've sat in some of those meetings also in the continuum of care, where there was a thought process that we are unique in New York. We do things different. Yeah, you pour a lot of fucking money in a hole, right? That's what you do different. You waste a lot of fucking money because you don't collaborate. You don't work together, and that's what needs to change. So, Nichele, I really appreciate you articulating that the way you did, right? Because it's not often that we can get people in positions of power like yours, and I don't want to say you're a power monger, but the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness has access to the Hill, can be influential if worked with correctly. Let me put it that way. And I saw a lot of resistance when you guys came here and I was trying to reach out to government to bring folks together, right? So there's this prevailing attitude that we do things different. And I think it's problematic in New York and it definitely needs to change.
I do want to just jump in real quick and say it's not like that in all of New York. Because I've worked very closely with Ithaca and they had state folks around the table. And so it's happening in other places. They're figuring out how to work with the state government and especially something about Code Blue, but using that Code Blue system to actually start figuring out how to get people in shelters and then into permanent housing. So using the tools that are available from the state to their benefit. Again, scale is very different, but if I could find a way to get New York City officials and state officials to sit down, and I will do whatever I can to help, broker those conversations.
Nichele, just quickly also, add Minnesota to that list of states that are doing it differently and doing it effectively. Minnesota seems to work together with their cities in a way to push the envelope forward.
Minnesota is probably, that's who we're watching because they also had a supermajority of Democrats, and so they were pushing legislation for housing that I've never seen before. Like, it's out of this world. I would love to see what's gonna happen in a couple of years with the level of housing. They might actually become the first state to end homelessness.
That's right.
I just want to quickly add in terms of all the places that were mentioned as somewhat unique. So Portland, Maine, mass tenant organizing passed rent control a few years ago. St. Paul, Minnesota, mass tenant campaign to pass rent control, was it 2 or 3 years ago? Ithaca, New York, opted into its own local version of good cause eviction, running a vacancy survey to try and opt into rent stabilization. So, there's certainly a piece of it that's, different levels of government collaborating. And there's also just, again, that whatever level of government needs to be responsive to, mass organized tenants and the solutions they're demanding.
From a community perspective, what would that look like? Victoria or Audrey, in terms of there are state resources, there are city resources, there are federal resources, they're not as well coordinated. Usually the best way to coordinate things like that is at the local level. What could we do to address homelessness, housing instability, neighborhood by neighborhood? Do you have some ideas or some places to point us to?
Well, there are certain organizations that have come together during COVID when the city was going to put a couple of homeless shelters in the financial district. There was a loud outcry from part of the community and a huge pushback from the other part of the community saying that we want to make sure that people have a home. And that was echoed in the community board, which is I think it's only New York City that has community boards, correct? So, but in any case, so that was very helpful. In terms of ending homelessness, it is actually, the local people need to say, yeah, we want affordable housing, we want to have, shelters, or we want to have housing for people who otherwise wouldn't. We have to make space for that. We have to be willing to convert down. I'm speaking very specifically from downtown because that's where I'm from.
That's what I want.
But the conversion of the office buildings downtown, because in Midtown there are actual, and maybe journalists at architects you would know better. There's actual.
I'm not an architect.
Oh, sorry. I thought I heard you work, but anyways, I think in Midtown there are more complications in terms of converting some of those buildings. Downtown, not so much because they're much older, and we do have a lot of vacancies in the office buildings. So again, there I think the community is open to and accepting of that. So I'm not sure if I quite answered your question, but I think that's there are local people who organize locally to help people who need housing, and then there's also working with the elected officials to make sure that we create that kind of thing.
Go ahead.
So Nichele is a state program that worked, right? So why not bring it back? And believe it or not, one of the first Nichele projects is Left Rack City in Queens, right? Co-op City. These are projects that work. But what happened is when you left a loophole or a little hole for folks to opt out and take advantage of the market rate, they bail, man. But you can put protections in there to keep this longer. It's more than a 30-year program. Just like a community land trust is in perpetuity, maybe Nichele project should be in perpetuity.
We have affordable housing in perpetuity, and that's NYCHA, and nobody likes it, right? Because There are so many good things about Nichele, but it's so hard to maintain the housing properly and to do the periodic reinvestment that needs to be done to keep housing habitable. And unfortunately, part of the reason is because it's protected as permanently affordability. There's never a crisis that demands that we invest in it. And we've had this slow decline to the point where we're now at this point where we have billions, tens of billions of dollars of capital investment that needs to be
It's
done.
systemic disinvestment.
That's
Just
right.
like Nichele said, the
Yeah.
mortgage tax deduction for people, for wealthy homeowners. If you took that away from wealthy homeowners and put it back towards public housing, it's gonna change.
Yeah.
Right? That's the way you reinvest in public housing. It's not that difficult, but you're subsidizing wealthy homeowners more than you are poor people. It's problematic, but we don't talk about it
I
enough.
totally agree, but I'm trying to figure out, given the current power structure, how do we ensure that that we're able to get some improvements? I mean, right now what I'm seeing is public housing funding. Everybody agrees that we need tens of billions of dollars of reinvestment just in New York City. I mean, there was an $80 billion ask in the federal budget for the nation that got left on the cutting room floor because the power structure that we're operating in didn't let it happen. So what can we do to protect affordable housing? One of the things that has been done over time is to create structures where the housing, in order for the people who invested in the housing, that invested in low-income housing tax credits, the housing had to be fully occupied by income-eligible people, and they didn't get their tax breaks unless it continued to be well-run. It's a very expensive program. Lawyers make tons of money on tax credit law and the monitoring and everything, but the fact is it has been very successful at making the housing, the affordable housing, be habitable not just on day one, but 15, 30 years after the fact. Not always, but it seems to be doing a better job at that than some of the earlier attempts where we just built the housing and hoped that it stayed up. And if we need money to fix it, we'll go to Congress. Well, Congress is not interested, right? And so I'm trying to figure out ways that we can protect people knowing that there is a power imbalance. And I'm not exactly certain how best to get there.
I mean, I have some thoughts on that. I think there are obviously more immediate things that feel more tangible right now. I also think it is really important to fight for, to fully fund public housing.
Yes.
Every other developed country on the face of the earth is somehow magically able to operate perfectly successful public housing. I mean, Rob and I were talking earlier before this started just about how incredibly racialized housing is in America. It's not a big surprise why public housing has been incredibly disinvested in. It's because it's associated and stigmatized as being housing for low-income people of color. And I think it's really important to do the long-term work of countering that stigma and saying, wait, this is actually the most successful program when you think about long-term stability. When you think about the fact that Nichele has a 50-year waiting list. Like clearly there's things that are working for it. So obviously you pointed out correctly, like overnight, the Congress is not going to fully fund the tens of billions of dollars of backlog, but I think it's important to, while we work on, more immediate strategies to really not accept the premise that it was a failure and keep, have our like political North Stars out there of no, we do, like this is the most successful one and we are fighting for this long term. So, I just think of a yes.
That's a very good point, and I think that, the way we talk about these things, myself included, it's important to acknowledge the successes as well as the shortcomings. I think that we often, the perfect often becomes the enemy of the good as we try to plan the perfect housing systems and they depend on, you know, people's best natures, and people aren't always acting in their best nature, and so, you know, sometimes you have to build safeguards as well. It's an ongoing process. I don't know if, I think we're running out of time. If there's any questions from the audience, or if anybody wants any final things to say,
yes,
or
thank
maybe
you.
we can just be thrown out of the room.
Thank you, Ted. Thank you, Ted. So I'm going to give one of these two to share the mic here, and you two can share that mic. I'm going to, wow, I see hands already. I see 5 hands, okay. So what we're going to do is we're going to try to make this fair. 2 things to keep in mind. One question per person, just to be able to address everyone in the room. Please keep it short, less than 20 seconds. And we'll do 2 questions from the audience first, and then we'll do 2 questions via Zoom. I think people have been furiously typing in the chat, but we're trying to keep track as best we can. I'll take these 2 here first, these 2 over here, and then we'll take it there, and then I'll do this. Should we come down? I'll go to you. Okay. Hi, thanks for having us. I just have a question about the limitations on making federal funds and state funds available to affordable housing developers, because there's a lot of, my own landlord has about 124 properties, and they are actively unhousing people from rent-stabilized units. And on one hand, on the other hand, they're taking affordable housing funds from state and federal funds and actually benefiting on both sides. And it disturbs me to no end, and the only person I've heard talking about this is Elizabeth Warren and her housing plan when she originally was running for president. There's no investigation. Why isn't there any investigation into the property or the portfolio-wide activities of these investors who are accessing our public funds while we are going fucking broke? Excuse my language.
Yes.
So, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. They should be monitored, they should be looked at, and any funding should be contingent on their behavior in terms of how they conduct, how they are running their other houses. If they're not, I mean, absolutely, and we definitely need that across the board with any kind of benefit. There has to be more controls, and there has to be not just there have to be consequences if you don't actually provide the service that we're asking you to provide, to giving the benefit that we're giving you, which is giving you money that would otherwise be coming back to the people.
I would just quickly make the argument that we need to organize our communities, right? There is a group of young folks with technical skills called the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project that puts together a lot of data like this to give to community groups to make their arguments. And we have to get involved, and I think it's a cross-section of society that has to do it, not just the people directly affected, college students, academics, legal services, all have to come together. This is our community, and we have to take back the power, right? We control the community, more of us than it is of them.
Mm-hmm. Hi, my name is Paige. I have a question about the recent Airbnb legislation that happened this past fall. I'm curious if you all know if that's affected like vacancy rates or anything along those lines, and has it helped, and have we seen any positive effect from that? I actually haven't heard much about it. I'm really curious.
Yeah, so the quick answer is that it's too early to immediately tell the results of what's come back onto the rental market. As of before these regulations fully came online last summer, there were maybe 60,000 short-term rentals, including Airbnb, maybe about 40,000 Airbnbs in the city. Over half of those, the city, or the majority of those, the city estimates were operating illegally without proper, they were not in compliance with the law. Local 18 came online in September, asked hosts to register their units. Immediately, there was, I think, an 85% drop of listed short-term rentals. Now there is a few thousand that have gone through the application process. I think there's maybe like 2,000 that have been fully approved. There's a few that are, there's a couple thousand of them that are pending because the host didn't provide enough information. So we know that there's been an 85% drop of these listings. The question that isn't entirely clear is where have they gone? There was a great piece in Hellgate today, kind of tracking this, and by its author Neil DeMouse, and I'm quoted in it, so that's why I like it. And basically, it points to some studies that it's going to take a little while for us to know, and one of the things that will have to be settled first is there's going to be a counter challenge from hosts funded by Airbnb to try and change this law, and there might be some folks who are waiting to see how that settles until they decide, okay, now if I can't do that, now I'm going to put this back into the rental market.
Okay, so we have a lot of very vocal people in the chat, but none of them with questions. So I'm going to go to these two people first, and then if there are no more questions, these two next.
There is a person online that has a question. Mark Greenberg has had his hand up probably for over half of the time I've been on. It's about 30 minutes.
Yeah, but it's supposed to be in the chat.
I took it down, but I put it back up again when I was invited.
Okay, well, let's get to this one first and we'll review that, because as far as I know, it's a comment versus a real question, so we'll review it.
Hi, thanks. It was kind of posed to people at one point that, like what is it we can do within the current power structure? But, from my experience with organizing, there's not much we can do to help with their housing situation within the current power structure. So do people have thoughts about how we change that power structure?
Well, I think something I was thinking when Charlie mentioned the 50-year waiting list for NYCHA, was that?
Yeah, it's somewhere in that.
Something like that. I think it doesn't necessarily reveal success of NYCHA as much as the need for housing for everyone, the lack of affordable housing for everyone. And so we've seen, I hope from the examples that I've given tonight, we can see how we have the power as a community to take things up ourselves. And we have the power to fight back, we have the power to make our own rezoning plan, for example, when we're not being protected. And I think that we all want to be able to have control over where we live, we all want control over where we work, and to not be harassed and have rent hikes from predatory landlords and be displaced. And so we are able to come together as a community and demand what we want. And when we organize petitions and marches and rallies, then we've seen how it actually does affect change and actually puts pressure on developers and the city government. When we've also seen lawsuits and other avenues not work. An example I gave previously about the 2 bridges and the luxury towers, actually people in 2019 filed a lawsuit about the illegal approval of these luxury towers in our neighborhood, and we won that. But in typical fashion, the developers countersued and they won. And we also had a lawsuit about the visual environment, which was lost. And so we see how these avenues don't work, but we see how, when the community comes together, it literally has worked and the towers have not gone up. So I can see how we can change the structure through the community.
Yeah, I agree with Audrey, and I would just add specifically, so tenant organizing, community organizing can move mountains and rearrange power structures. I think one interesting place that I always think about starting and where it's important to focus on right now is anti-displacement, anti-eviction legislation, good cause eviction, expanding rent stabilization, whatever your platform of choice is, simply because if we are able to achieve stronger protections there, tenants are more likely to be able to get involved when they don't fear their immediate displacement, immediate eviction. I've seen it all the time in buildings that are organized in, where market rate tenants who are at risk of not having a lease renewed or an infant increase will make a pretty rational choice to say, hey, I can't get involved in fighting for this other thing, for these new repairs. If there are able to be some wins, some progress made on tenant protections, I think it would open up a new pool of people that could then really help that community effort.
Yeah, I think there's also power in having elected officials that actually represent our interests, like in Lower East Side Chinatown, our current council person, Chris Marte. He won the election because of such extreme community support, because his entire platform is on anti-displacement. And so even when in the recent re-election, the big developers were all funding the other candidates, and they were funding against every anti-displacement candidate in the city, all the other ones lost, and only Chris Marte won because there's such strong community support and outreach done by everyone. And so having someone that protects us, unlike Margaret Shin, the previous council person, who's backed by developers, we can see that his anti-displacement platform is what made him win, and also is what gives us more strength and gives us a platform.
Couple of quick responses and to piggyback off of what she just said. I'll just speak about Chris Marte because there was a big rally about two bridges where he was sort of challenged by the community to make a public commitment. And Audrey, he was a little fearful, but you guys forced him into making that commitment, and he finally did it. So sometimes you have to push, right? This is going back 2 or 3 years ago. But I do think we have to elect people in office, and Charlie just gave you proof with all those bills that are submitted. We have a progressive state legislature like we haven't had in the past, right? And it takes that. We have to go to the ballot box and elect the right people. Our city council is very progressive. 29 women. We've never had that, right? So you have to push. You have to go to the ballot box and vote. I'm not in favor of electoral politics, but I'll tell you what, there's somebody in the state legislature, Marcella Matenius, who I've been in the trenches with in the streets, right? And I know she's voting in favor of us. And then I'll connect it internationally. In 2013, I stood on Park Avenue in Manhattan holding a banner on behalf of Blackstone Equities, against Blackstone Equities with La Paz. And I was holding the other end of the banner from La Paz communication director, Ada Colau. She is now mayor of Barcelona, Spain, and she governs off a municipalist mandate that meets people's needs, right? It's all about human rights, right? This is how we're going to govern. She has 1 through 10 points. Changing the way that housing is happening in Barcelona, Spain. You have to get the right people in elected office.
Thank you for that. Okay, so we have Mr. Greenberg on Zoom. We're going to permit him to speak so that he can ask his question in 20 seconds or less.
Thank you. Can I be heard? Yes, good. Well, listen, thanks for such a great panel of a group of such committed advocates. I just wanted to, the question was about a pied-à-terre tax, which didn't go through. And I want to remind us that Scott Stringer suggested a number of years ago something called a real property transfer tax, because now money comes, money that goes into an affordable housing fund comes from the mortgage recording fee when someone purchases property using a mortgage, but no funds go into a fund, no money goes into a fund for affordable housing when someone purchases a property using cash, and therefore the people with the most money give the least to the state to build affordable housing. And we don't know where this money comes from, but we know that buying property is a great way to launder money. There are cities around the world where the real property transfer tax could be 10 or 15%. I think Toronto is one. I think London maybe. This is something that would be hard for anyone to publicly oppose, except, of course, elected officials who get money from people who buy property with cash are very happy to privately oppose it because they don't want that spigot to turn off. But I think if this were a public question to elected officials, it'd be hard for them to justify not taxing property that was purchased in cash to create a fund for affordable housing statewide. So I just wanted to get people's thinking about that.
That's a good point, Mark, and I think it's a good exhibit for us in that, sunlight is the best disinfectant, bringing these issues to the forefront and making people take a public stance seems to be the theme in the last 5 or 10 minutes. And I think it really is one of the ways that you're able to move the needle, right? Is that you make people say what they stand for and you get them to hold your positions. And when things, so many things get decided in Albany when no one's looking, and so bringing attention to things like the real estate transfer tax and how it's administered is really worthwhile endeavor.
You want to add something?
Sure, yeah. So I just want to Rob, I just wanted to back up for a second about what you said about Chris Marte, because I remember from that incident back then, it was really more of a setup. It was his.
I know it was,
It was
but
not
yeah.
him.
I felt bad. Honestly, I felt bad for him because he was
And,
put there on the spot. It was before the
Right,
election,
he was-
before his first term.
Right, and I have to give another shout out to Chris Marte for having been the first elected official to support us at 5 World Trade Center. Yes, I believe very much in the sunlight. You know, the questioner, and I'm sorry I don't remember your name, but brought up a really good question. So one thing that I do think we want to think about is housing stability, and typically home ownership is something that gives that. This, it sounds like, is specifically geared towards cash payment, transfer, and that's, I don't know who has cash on hand to buy a house, so I'm all for that. But I do think having these questions and, asking our elected officials where they land on this. But truly, like, the people who are getting the biggest subsidies are the big landlords. They are the ones who are getting the biggest subsidies, and those who are building, and those who are building with only 20% affordability. So I think that's where we really want to make sure we focus on those, because that's money lost to the state and the city, that money that we could use towards affordable housing.
Next question.
Thank you. I happen to live in affordable housing. I'm very lucky. I live here in Manhattan in a development called Penn South, which was built by the International Ladies Garment Workers Union in the 1960s. Are you aware of any current projects that are being built with either pension funds or by labor unions in the same? Anyway, let's give a shake of hands. I'm also interested in asking, are you aware of Penn South and that it's sustained for this long? And the fact that the community has sustained it in an affordable way, I think, is a shining beacon to sort of take note of.
Yeah, I mean, we use pension fund investments to invest in affordable housing all the time. You just don't, it's not as visible as Penn South and other big developments that have happened in the past, but when I'm trying to develop affordable housing, we have to get a lender, and the lender, we want the lender that will lend to us at the lowest rate, right? And pension funds and life insurance companies want very stable, very long-term investments, so they can give a lower rate than banks and others that specialize in more risky investments. They don't get as much credit for it. They're not doing it out of charity. They're still making money, but it's at a low but steady, stable, less risky instrument in the loans.
Yeah, I would also add that Penn South and a lot of those projects, so the Abe Kazan projects, Housing Fund, a lot of them were also had bonds and funding from the state level that got cut completely after Co-op City, or that was the last one, and helped, but broader political changes, advent of neoliberalism, but there's no political will right now to provide bonds and things like that for positive funding. It's just tax abatements on the other end of things, and I think it's something that's important to think about because it's so successful.
Because you're in academia, I would caution what pension funds we look at. So one of the things I've been involved in is TIA-CREF. And TIA-CREF is investing their funds outside of the U.S. to grab land, right? And so I would be very careful, right? In Brazil, that's a big problem in Brazil, and my relationship with folks in Brazil. So there's a lot going on with TIA-CREF funds going outside of the U.S. to land grab in other countries.
Next question.
Hi. I wanted to ask one question. I'm not understanding what is luxury, because they go up every day in my neighborhood, and I've been living in that neighborhood for over 30 years, and I'm not understanding what's luxury. Brooklyn. I live in Brooklyn.
I make the argument anything you and I can't afford is luxury.
No, but I don't see what's luxury in the space that causes them to hike up the rent so high.
You know, luxury is an advertising term. I've seen a lot of buildings called luxuries that certainly aren't. You know, I think a better term and one that can be more accurate in a lot of these cases is just market rate. These are buildings where the landlord can charge whatever they want. There aren't income restrictions. There aren't rent regulations, and I think that's literally the $1 million question.
Cause to draw so much money to say that this apartment is luxury, you can't afford it, it's $3,000. What do you have in that space that's worth $3,000?
But people will pay it, that's the argument, the market, people are willing to pay it. So that's where our problem lies, right? They know they can get it, so they're gonna advertise it at that price. Whether you think it's worth it or not, or whether I think it's worth it, right? Somebody's gonna pay the rent, right? And so that's the way they look at it.
Most of them apartments is.
Okay, thank you. Next question.
Great panel.
It's on.
Great panel. Just a quick question. What impact do you think this surge of immigrants coming from, you mentioned Texas as a cooperative state. No, coming from Texas to New York City, Chicago, where we have black mayors, what impact is that having on the conversation around housing? Mayor Adams sets up this, congregate emergency care, and some New Yorkers say, oh, how come they get apartments and other opportunities that we don't get? So I think it's poisoning the conversation. Any feedback on that?
I would say that issues like this of displacement and luxury development aim to divide us, aim to blame it on people are coming in, transplants, that's why it's going up, young people, students, artists, etc. But in reality, we're all affected by displacement, we all have to pay rent, we're all affected by these things. So what's the one thing that unites us? So these conversations about immigrants and other people, it's really just a distraction to divide us, and we have to remember that the true enemy is the developers. That's the person who is profiting from this, not people coming in, not young people, not artists, etc.
No, I think she's very well said, Audrey. I agree completely.
All right, next question.
There's a lot of chatter going around about the collapse of the commercial real estate industry, and that maybe we should convert like a 20% vacancy rate, and that it might be able to be converted into housing. How likely is that, number one? Second part of it is, how likely, if it does happen, will it have affordable housing?
Well, I think, so it's likely, they've done it, they've already converted some. I think it's possible, and it's very not difficult, it's certainly in Lower Manhattan, not that difficult. Will they be affordable? That's a bigger question, and that really comes down to pressuring our politicians and our representatives, that if you're going to convert, there are certain requirements that you're going to have to abide by. And I would include in that requirement not just affordable housing, but you have to make the building green, right? Let's move away from fossil fuels while you're doing this.
All right, this is the next question.
Good evening. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So, this has been a very involved conversation. I'm of multiple minds on this topic, so maybe my question's not be that clear. But as someone that grew up in Jersey, I don't know if I can consider it a new plant or not. I'm kind of like in between both worlds from my perspective because I'm a local, but I'm not from New York. But I currently work in housing eviction prevention. So I work in the Bronx, and in my office today, I'm right next to Housing Court, and it's just a line of people. And this is a very abstract question for me personally, but I'm just kind of shocked that how is it that so many people can't afford to pay their rent? Like, why is it that it's such an issue that the rents can't be marked based on the local incomes? And again, this is abstract to me. I'm trying to make it short. But the other part, in regards to the transplant aspect of this conversation, again, from Jersey. So you can vote tomatoes or not, but I think a big part of this discussion is also the fact that we've been switched to such hyper-focused service economy that the question I have regarding that is, you know, a lot of the housing was linked to the local factories back in the day, right? Or the local production back in the day. And then you have articles about like the Domino's Sugar Factory becoming like this luxury office. So what type of service industry or service economy are we trying to build in the city that actually takes into effect like diversified incomes?
1968, Robert Abrams said, this is going to be a city for the wealthy. And we're seeing it come to fruition, right? Somebody mentioned earlier, I think it was Nichele that mentioned that the minimum wage paid in the US today isn't enough to house anybody, right? So it's, you know, things have to change. We've gotten away from manufacturing. We've taken advantage of countries overseas to produce and manufacture the way that we used to, so there aren't good, stable jobs there. Things have changed. And this is the argument I make about home ownership. When people start saying home ownership leads to wealth, I argue it leads to perpetual debt, right? Conditions have changed and not the same as they were 30, 40, 50, 60 years ago. And we have to understand that. It's difficult for us to believe in, but it is changing. With respect to housing court, we've never addressed poverty in this country. And when you look at the local, I forgot how you phrase it, at the local wages that people make, or something of that nature, well, we use area median income to track that. The 5 boroughs of New York City, Nassau, Suffolk, 2 wealthier counties to the east, and Putnam County, a non-contiguous county to the northwest. So it's always going to inflate the number, right? It's a flawed calculation. So how we calculate incomes in neighborhoods just doesn't work. I make the argument, use zip code. Every neighborhood in the country is not by zip code. It's the political will to do that.
So this ends the Q&A section portion of the program. Do you have something else you want to add?
Oh, I was just gonna say before we all leave, are we doing a call to action, or should I bring it up now? Yes. Or should I wait?
Yes.
I just didn't know what the time was.
Call us out, Alice.
Okay.
Call for action.
Call to action alert. So one thing I wanted to bring to everyone was that currently we have this jail letter, anti-jail letter, that I want to bring forth in case there are organizations that can sign on to this. But essentially, it is a letter petition standing against the mega jail in Chinatown and in support of the Chinatown Working Group rezoning plan. So in favor of community rezoning that protect the community. And so we have the letter if there are organizations or people that want to sign it. So I just wanted to let everyone know. Time to come together.
I'd like to add, please support passage in Albany of the Housing Access Voucher Program that Senator Kavanaugh sponsored and Assemblymember Linda Rosenthal is the sponsor in the Assembly. But that's, it's just one piece of the pie, it's one part of the puzzle, but it is a solution that will help us to help people afford to stay in their homes. It's a great program that will need to grow over time, but we need to get it passed now. So please try to help support that.
I have 2 flyers over there. One is the general West Side Neighborhood Alliance info for anyone who lives on the west side of Manhattan. Please pick it up, see what's going on. We have some upcoming meetings. And then there's a flyer for a rally we're putting together this Saturday at noon in Hell's Kitchen. There are some pretty, horrific proposals in that the governor's backing in the state budget to really weaken and water down rent stabilization. Pretty cataclysmic if they were to come to pass. So we are rallying against that. If you are looking for a nice way to spend an hour on a cold Saturday afternoon, pick up that flyer and see you on Saturday.
Get involved in community events, folks. by sitting here doing nothing, nothing's gonna change. There are community groups all over the city doing good work. Reach out to those groups, get involved, man. Sitting on your ass is not gonna change anything, man. It's not gonna change anything. And then we have to get out and vote. We have to get to the ballot box and make social change, right? And the only real social change we've ever achieved in this country is from direct action and civil disobedience. That means putting our asses in the streets.
On that note, I think we should conclude. So thank you everybody for attending. And thank you to our panelists and to the Midtown South Community Council. Have a good night.
Thank you all for being. Thank you all. Thank you all. Hello. Testing. Hello. Hi. Thank you all for being here. Nichele, I wish you were here. I wish I could reach out and touch you. You're amazing. You're really amazing because you speak very honestly and you don't hold back, which is really wonderful for somebody being in your position. And Audrey, my God,
better not let you go.
being in the fight like you are at your age, it's great. Victoria, thanks for being here. I've seen you fighting for the World Trade Center and keep that fight going. And then once you get in office, if you get in office, hopefully you're going to get in office. But wait a minute, you're never mind. We want you for the right things, and we want to coalesce too. We all have to really coalesce. I mean, we can't work in these silos like what Nichele said. It's very important. If we do get involved in these groups, we've got to connect. We've got to figure out how to bring that web together, okay? Because this is a fight between us and the developers who have a hold, the real estate industry, who has a hold on this city like no other.
Yes.
Okay, and they run this city. Charlie, thanks for being here. Charlie, great job. He's connected with a few groups. I see him online with Right to Council. We're already connected with 3 different groups: Right to Council and WESNA and Housing Conservation Coordinators. Okay, it's a lot to go to these meetings. But that's what we need to do, regroup and come together and fight together. And Rob has been a rock for the council. He's an advisor. He's been there on the ground, literally on the ground. And he's a professor of economics. He's got insights that just from the lived experience you cannot get anywhere else. I've learned a lot by doing, and that beats all, well, to me anyway, beats all of the theoretical, talk conversations. And Ted is amazing. He's been there in the nonprofit world, he's been there in the government, and he's full of insights. And I think he's one of the best moderators there is. He just keeps it flowing, and he keeps a smooth operation going. And we had a lot of technical issues. We tried to pull it together, and Ted made it look very nice and easy. And I appreciate it, Ted. I appreciate you.